Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. Our guest this morning is the Bishop of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, David Zubik. Bishop Zubik has been talking about some changes that are coming announced this weekend and will be taking full effect in October. And that is, I'm going to call again, a consolidation of parishes. And in the long run, 2 to 5 years, you may be looking at closing churches and things like that, just to make the church more vibrant, as you say. How will this necessarily make it vibrant?
You know, in some of our churches, you have as few as 11 people coming to a Sunday morning Mass. You know, I think that there'll be fewer Masses, but they provide opportunity for more people to come together to worship and to be able to see, wow, this is terrific to have all of these folks come together. You take a look at what happens on days like Christmas. Christmas Eve, you take a look at what happens on Easter. That's my dream, that every Sunday our churches can be filled by having people come to say, this is exciting, that we come together as a people who are recognizing the importance of Jesus in our lives, and we're coming to celebrate that.
So that begs the question, why aren't they coming like they are on Christmas Eve and on Easter Sunday?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons. The most, I think, prominent of all is that we've become pretty secular in our society, and those voices are particularly strong. I think that also, you know, there's a relativism that's an important part of all this, that people say, well, I can pretty much determine the truth, and I can determine what my relationship is with God, and I don't have to worry about coming to church. I can pray in my room. Except when you take a look at, from our perspective, how important the Eucharist is. And if we really believe that the Eucharist is, in fact, the presence of Jesus, you can't get that anywhere except by coming to Mass.
Now, Bishop, the fastest growing element of in America and perhaps around the world in the religious sense are nuns, and we're not talking about people wearing habits.
N-O-N-E-S.
N-O-N-E-S, people with no religion. Why do we think this is occurring, in addition to what you've just said, particularly among those in this generation, and what can we do about that?
I think that in some instances the faith isn't being passed on. And I think the primary teachers of the faith in every religion has to be the parents. And I would have to say, taking a look at, I think it was my generation that began to not take seriously the passing on of our faith. And so each generation that goes after that, it's going to become even less of a priority. And I think what we're trying to do here is to reverse that particular trend.
And are there specific strategies for the nuns?
I think we're going to try to attract their attention by things like the Festival of Praise that I referred to in the earlier segment.
And this is occurring in the Jewish religion?
It is.
And other denominations within the Christians?
And you can be sure we talk about that. You know, when I get together with my buddies on Christian Associates, we talk about how that's happening with the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the Anglicans. When I talk to my rabbi friends, they talk about the very same thing as well too. And you know, they've been very interested in what we're basically doing, and have really kind of encouraged the direction that I'm taking with the Church of Pittsburgh.
I want to go back to something you just said, because it was very interesting, because it goes hand in hand with a Gallup poll that was just released, and it says the steepest decline in Catholic Church attendance among U.S. Catholics occurred between the 1950s and the 1970s, when the percentage saying that they had attended church in the past 7 days fell by more than 20 percentage points in that particular time period. That was also the time period, especially during the 60s, that the changes from Vatican II were being instituted within the church. Is there a correlation between that people were accustomed to going to a Latin Mass and the regimentation of the Catholic Church to a kind of a big change that the Church underwent?
I want to reshape that question slightly with my friend Stacy here. And did Vatican II cause this, or did Vatican II reflect this?
You know, I don't want to blame that on Vatican II, because I think the Vatican II really helped an awful lot of people come to understand their faith in a more exciting way than they did before. But I think when you take a look at what was happening in the 1960s, sure, there was the Vatican Council, but there was also the Vietnam War, and there was protest.
All sorts of authority
right, exactly.
being challenged.
Exactly, and I think there was a time of great revolution. And I think this is a time for me of evolution. You know, and I think we can take the lead from a great leader that we have in the church today, Pope Francis, who's really kind of opened the eyes of an awful lot of people in terms of what the Catholic Church really means and what our focus really has to be. So I think I'm looking at this as an evolution of deepening in faith.
Perhaps on that side of it, I'm going to go back to the Gallup poll here for just a second, and it
Sure.
says after stabilizing the mid-2000s, weekly church attendance among U.S. Catholics has resumed its downward trajectory. In particular, older Catholics have become less likely to report attending church in the past 7 days, so that now, for the first time, a majority of Catholics in no generational group attend weekly. Have you found that to be here true in Pittsburgh as well?
I don't know that I've seen that in terms of some of our senior population to see a decrease. I have to honestly say my own experience of our southwestern Pennsylvania area, both for Catholics and other religions, is that there's a very deep respect for organized religion. I think that if there is a decrease in the numbers of people, I think it all depends on the area. If the population has shrunk in that area. In other areas, I've seen an increase of it as well, too. So I haven't seen that reflection of that trend that's been reported, that you're reporting in Pittsburgh as much.
Bishop, this is a country that was founded with the separation of church and state, and yet religion was one of the founding principles or one of the founding inspirations for our country. Does a country that's more secular become a different country?
I believe so.
And in what way?
I think that, in all honesty, you know that over the course of the last decade or so, all across the board, we talk about religious freedom and how that would in fact be respected. I think, you know, in our day, so many people feel the necessity of not referring to how sacred Christmas is and what it's about, or how important Hanukkah is, and I think that says something about, you know, trends that are moving away from even a recognition of the beauty of what our faiths are
But I
about.
would also say, Bishop, that 3 of our last 4 presidents have been, and 4 of our last 6 presidents have been more visible in their religiosity and in their pull towards spiritualism than any president beforehand.
And I don't want to tag that on any president. I think I want to say that overall, I think the bigger picture of what's happening in secular society has been a non-recognition of the beauty of faith.
But you have President Clinton, President Carter, President Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Obama, who are outwardly involved in their church.
Right.
In a way that President Truman, President Roosevelt, President Harding, President Coolidge were not.
And that's why I'm not blaming that on the presidents. I'm blaming it on a basic trend that we see operating in our society, which is, you know, almost to dismiss the beauty of
But how do you
religion.
account for the presidential prominence of religion in their rhetoric and in their personal behavior?
Well, I think that says something about who they are as persons, and we can be grateful for that. But obviously, their own personal connection, and I think a lot of times you'll see that politicians will say, well, I'm a faith-filled person. I'm not necessarily going to impose that on the world in which we live, and that's not something we may have heard earlier from presidents.
One of the issues we brought up in the first segment, and that is a number of priests that are available to minister to the flock. It's been declining. The numbers have been declining as well. You've got an aging priest population here in Pittsburgh. How's the pipeline? Do you have many new priests coming up through the seminary?
I have to say this year we had 8 new guys come into our formation program. We're looking at almost as many this coming year. I think that the number of men that we have coming in, obviously we're drawing from a much smaller birth rate. When you take a look at when I entered the seminary 50 years ago, we were the baby boomer generation. And what we're faced with now is that my contemporaries are all coming to the point of retiring. That number for just 3 years, men who were ordained in 73, 74, and 75 when I was ordained, that's 100 guys in the Diocese of Pittsburgh that are going to be retiring. So when you compare that with 27 men who are in the formation program, you see what's happening there. So I think that, you know, but what I do have to say is our men who are coming into the formation program today, I find them to be far more mature and far more focused on what they're getting into than we were in our day. So I find them to be more mature and more alert and really welcoming to what challenges they're going to face.
Do you think the church is past the negativity of the pedophile priest scandal?
I think we have to keep on working at trying to take care of our victims. And I think that's an issue that remains on the front page, not only for the church, but we see it all the time in terms of what's happening in public schools, what's happening even in our society, the Me Too movement. There's something about where we are that speaks to the need for organized religion to move beyond a secularism that I think results in some of the stuff that we're seeing. And I think that what has happened in society and what happened in the church is tragic. We have to keep on working to try to respond to the needs of victims. That has to be the #1 concern.
We only have about 30 seconds or so it's probably not a fair question to throw out at this moment. But we did a report recently on the growth of mega churches, as they're known, in the Pittsburgh area. What do you think they're doing that is drawing, and obviously some Catholics there as well?
Exactly what we're trying to do, make our coming together more alive. And I think that they provide an environment that's inviting. If we haven't done a good job in terms of inviting people to come back, that's why we're on mission for the Church Alive.
Bishop, thank you so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition.
Good, thanks.
David, I'll be back with some final thoughts in just a moment.